So I'm Bob Hawes, I'm the CEO of the Hunter Business Chamber. Hello to everybody again. Thanks for joining this session. This is the second one we've run in a series. We had a private last week that went pretty well. This one was put together at very short notice. I'd like to thank Amy and Nathan for being able to accommodate that and making it happen. But most importantly, thank you for everyone for taking time out of your diaries to be with us today. To hear a different view of COVID-19 from over there in the world hotspot at the moment, being in New York. So I look forward to hearing more on that further. I'll hand over to Amy now, who'll introduce Nathan, and then we'll run through the session. So thanks again, everybody.
Yep, great. Okay, thank you very much, Bob, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Hunter Business Chamber members, you will know that we run, quite an extensive program of events during the year where we bring expert opinions and advice to our members. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that face to face at the moment, but we thought we'd still like to be able to connect with our members in this way and bring them sort of those sorts of insights that we do through our series during the year. So we thought we'd kick off with an all-member webinar. Nathan is someone that I used to work with when I was a journalist. I don't know if I'm giving too much away, Nathan, by saying we worked together probably 25, maybe a little bit longer years ago at the Newcastle Herald. Nathan has since worked at a number of major titles, including the Sydney Morning Herald. He's now a journalist with News Corp, and he's based in New York with his wife, who also writes for News Corp, but he's also had a number of corporate communications roles with the likes of AGL and Fortescue Metals Group. So I thought it'd be really interesting to hear from Nathan, just an Australian in New York's perspective of what's happening with coronavirus, just generally, but also from a business perspective. Just wondering, as someone who's living in New York, if you could tell us a little bit, I guess, about your experience of the pandemic, from first hearing about the threat of coronavirus to where you are now in full lockdown, working from home, waking up every day to these revised tolls of hundreds and hundreds of deaths. Can you just walk us through how that's played out for you?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Amy, and thanks for having me here today. Yeah, look, I was thinking about this the other day, about the best way to try and describe the scale of what's happening here. I guess the first thing I'd say is it's beyond 9/11. It's way beyond 9/11, and 9/11 is always what everyone thinks of when they think about tragedy in New York. Well, I'll give you some numbers. So 2,900 people died in 9/11. In the past 6 days in New York, this has been the death toll: 777, 783, 758, 671. 778 and 752. Now that's a small country town dying every day. They've run out of funeral directors. They've run out of places to put the bodies. They've gone to a place called Hart's Island in the Bronx, which has always been used to bury the homeless, and they're burying hundreds of bodies there now. Just to put it in proportion for Australia, the US has 13 times the population of Australia, but it has 98 times the number of infections and 440 times the number of deaths. So you can see that one country has probably done a better job at the moment than another. As Amy discussed, I work for News Corp Australia's New York Bureau. So I essentially work during the day when you guys are asleep and update the News Limited masthead websites with international news. So a lot of stuff on Trump, a lot of stuff on royals, a lot of stuff on, whatever is breaking around the place. To be honest, it took a long time for the virus to get on the map over here, because you might remember, it seems like decades ago, but we were going through an impeachment of a president here earlier this year. We're also going through Democratic primaries to try and work out who was going to take on Donald Trump in November. So neither side was very engaged in this at all. And the Democratic mayor and the Democratic governor of New York were out telling people in the middle of March, it's fine, go on, live your lives, it's okay. By March the 26th, there were more 911 emergency calls in New York than there had been in 9/11. So things turned drastically and fast. And the lockdown, the same as you guys, it's become a frustrating grind. And I think the uncertainty over here about when we can get back to work or when we can get back to living our lives, normally, whatever the new normal is, as they say, I think that is a very common feeling now.
Yeah, I think that that image of is it the Harts Island where the mass graves were being dug was one of the ones that really brought home the stark reality for me, and also the field hospital in Central Park. I mean, what are those sort of images doing just to the psyche of people in New York?
Well, it's funny because, as everyone knows, I mean, New York thrives on the teeming masses of tourists and commuters, and there's often a bit of argy-bargy between the two. But I tell you what, no one in the business community at the moment would be complaining about having tourists blocking the sidewalks. I mean, Manhattan is just a silent, creepy graveyard. That's the only way to describe it. And when you think of New York, you think about going to the theatre, going to a ball game, going to a restaurant, going to a bar. It's all closed, and the indications now that major sporting and entertainment venues won't reopen this year. So it's pretty dire, but conversations have started about trying to reopen the states, and as you can imagine, in an election year, it's an incredibly political issue.
Yeah, Nathan, tell us a little bit about what the impact on business has been in New York generally. We're interested too in which business are still operating. How are they going about it?
Yeah, well, I guess again, similar to you guys, the only businesses open are pharmacies, supermarkets, and corner stores. What they call delis or bodegas here, and gas stations, and that's about it. And it's very quiet. It's very tough for business. And the other thing that is still open, I believe it's the same in Australia, is the bottle shops. And there was a big, everyone here was terrified when the lockdown was announced, and everyone rushed out and thought the bottle shops were going to be shut down. In fact, packaged booze sales are up 22% in the US, so everyone's obviously self-medicating. The restaurants and pubs are selling takeout meals. A couple of weeks back, that meant that you could walk into the pub, order food, not buy a drink, but you could go. Now the signs are up. You're not allowed to enter any restaurants now. You have to text ahead, pick up the food on the sidewalk. So look, it did take New York a long time to take it seriously, but I went for a run this afternoon around my local area, and I can tell you, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, as soon as someone sees you coming on the footpath, they've moved to the other side, or vice versa. So, it has sunk in. The governor, Andrew Cuomo, announced today that all New Yorkers must wear face masks now when they leave the house. He's going to give people 3 days grace to do that. He doesn't want to bring in fines. He said there's no point in fining people, but we've got to do something.
Can you actually source those face masks? That's an issue here.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, so much of American commerce now is done on Amazon, and Amazon's sort of ground to a halt on a lot of items. It is very difficult to get hold of masks. And as you guys would know, there's been a lot of stories about medical health experts on the front line here not being able to get access to proper protective gear, and even resorting to wearing bin liners to protect themselves. So what I was going to mention was that Mayor de Blasio said today that he estimates the New York economy's lost about $10 billion already, but that sounds pretty conservative.
Yeah. Look, businesses all over the world are trying to adapt and innovate to survive this crisis. Have you come across some interesting stories over there of businesses that are pivoting or somehow changing their business model in order to continue trading? I mean, the restaurants are the one we've all heard, but are there other examples that you've come across over there?
Sadly, Amy, there's not a lot. The shutdown is so universal that there really isn't much scope left for businesses to be innovative. They're being told to shut down. People are being told to stay out of the city. So look, the restaurants and bars are trying hard with their takeout, but then you hear stories about the delivery companies here charging 30% of the price of the meal to deliver. So, the restaurants are really doing it tough. No one's catching Ubers or taxis anymore. I was thinking, my wife and I travel a lot for work. And so if we go away for 2 or 3 days, we're probably spending $2,000 or more on Ubers and airfares and hotels and meals. All of that has just ground to a halt in a country that has 160 million, employees. 20 million of those have already asked for unemployment benefits. Unfortunately, there just isn't a lot of room to move or innovate. To give you another idea, I'm sure you've all been to, a busy New York airport. They are operating, LaGuardia, JFK and Newark are currently operating at 5% capacity. Delta Airlines has gone from 150 flights a day to 15, and most of those flights are carrying one person.
Oh, goodness.
It's unbelievable.
What sort of government assistance is being provided to employers and employees? Is it something that varies state to state?
Look, it largely driven by Washington. There was an initial $3 trillion relief package announced, and that's going to provide checks worth about $1,200 US directly to families. And just out of interest, I thought I'm going to check what a trillion is. A trillion is $1 million. So it's huge money. And then the Federal Reserve has announced a $4 trillion in Aussie dollars, $4 trillion in loans for families, businesses and local government. So what the Fed is obviously trying to do is make sure that the business community and the economy is in some sort of decent shape once America starts to emerge out of this lockdown. Because what a lot of traders are worried about, there was actually an excellent article in the New Yorker about this this week. What a lot of traders here are worried about is what sort of shape the country was really in before this coronavirus pandemic hit. After the GFC, America got back on its feet, but a lot of people feel that the debt levels across corporate America were just unsustainable before this lockdown. Just how hard it's going to be to bounce back is really hard to imagine at the moment.
What's the view from where you are of what's going on in Australia, how the virus is being managed both from a health and an economic perspective?
Yeah, look, I think after the bushfires, when expats and Americans heard about how serious this virus was, and obviously Australia's proximity to China, everyone assumed the worst, and really there was a feeling over here, God, how's Australia going to cope with this now after what you've just been through that pushed the country right to the limits. But the interesting thing is, with a bit of hindsight, I actually think that Australia was on a much better footing to deal with this mentally than America was. You guys had been, on a war footing for months trying to stop those bushfires. I think it's pretty obvious that Canberra learned some lessons about how they handled the bushfires and the bushfire response. And I think Australia was probably in a much better headspace to deal with the crisis. America had that feeling of exceptionalism that it's not going to hurt us. This is a problem for China and the rest of the world, but we'll be fine. And that's the rhetoric that the president uses, and he used it for quite a while when the virus first broke out. And it took some pretty shocking projections that up to 2.4 million American lives could be lost to really focus his team.
I think, speaking of lessons learned, I think one of the lessons that our leadership learned was to listen to from the bushfire thing was to listen to the experts. In view of that, what impact has Trump's his decisions and public appearances of the past few days had on perceptions of his leadership over there?
Yeah, well, it's been fascinating here because there's been 2 daily shows that you can't miss. And the first one is New York Governor Andrew Cuomo doing his update late every morning. He does a televised update. He's become quite a social media rock star and very popular with the ladies, apparently. He calls it, he calls it as it is, and he's a real New Yorker, and he talks about the New York spirit, and we will fight, and we'll bend this curve, and there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully. Then the president does his briefings early evening, and he's flanked by Vice President Mike Pence, as well as Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx, and they are absolutely so respected in America for how they've persevered through some really, really tough times. They're absolute professionals, and you can imagine behind the scenes the arm wrestle that is going on between Trump's advisors telling him to reopen the country, and then you've got the health experts saying, "Look, don't do it. It's too soon. We've got to work harder." The other big thing in America, there's just a real lack of testing. So that's still a really big problem. And a lot of experts are saying, don't go back to work, don't let people out of their homes until we know how to test. And the other talk you guys would have heard is that everyone's racing now to get hold of an antibody, which will be like a prick to the end of your finger, and that will tell you in a test immediately whether or not you've got the antibodies to the virus, which means you've had the virus. Because this is one way they're talking here about getting people back out to work, is firstly looking at people who've had the virus and they assume they've got the antibodies, and they're in those younger age groups and they don't have underlying illnesses. So they're talking about trying to get those people back. But the other thing that Cuomo's talking about is actually ranking industries by sector and working out which ones are the most important and vital to get back online. He hasn't given any great narrative around that other than to suggest it. So that would mean that those industries would be identified to go back to work earlier than some others. But he's made the very practical point that, the offices and the factories that people work in are going to have to be completely redesigned to take note of social distancing, because no one here believes that social distancing is going to end anytime soon. And I see the stories from Australia. I think you're saying there as well that social distancing is going to be, a part of the new normal for a long time to come. So that's part of the story here about how they're looking at trying to reopen the country. But there's a real arm wrestle going on. You've got a president who wants his country to believe that that they're wealthy and everyone who wants a job will have a job. He doesn't want to go to an election with this mess around his neck. It's a really tough battle.
Yeah. Look, I'll go to that issue of reopening the economy shortly, but just a couple of questions that are coming in. Tracy McGillicott has asked, as an outsider, the Governor of New York appears to be doing an incredible job, and his communications are spot on. Is that the same perception over there?
Andrew Cuomo has been like a superstar, and people have taken a lot of comfort from his approach. Pretty much everyone you talk to in New York says it's a pity that Joe Biden won't stand aside and the party tap Cuomo on the shoulder. Cuomo's ruled it out absolutely. He has said he will not try and knock Joe Biden off. The only way he would come into the picture now would be if he's parachuted in, and Joe Biden stood aside. No one's even saying that's possible at the moment. But look, he's really impressed everyone. He's been the Democratic voice in the national debate. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders just disappeared. It was just the nature of how this story unfolded. And as you know, Trump's got 2.5, 3 hours of television every evening that he just talks and talks and talks. It's incredible how he's able to dominate the space like that. So Cuomo has been the Democratic foil to that.
Just another question here from Wayne Demar on a different issue. What's the view on China over there, and where does that leave the trade relationships and opportunities across the globe from an American viewpoint?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. I mean, the talk from Trump and a lot of his supporters is this proves that, you know, I was right about China. We've got to decrease our dependence on China. We've got to get our own manufacturing back up. You know, even if it costs more, we've got to start looking after ourselves. But something like 95 to 97% of pharmaceuticals come out of China into America. It's just impossible to think of an America, you know, that doesn't rely to a large degree on China. Obviously, they made that historic trade deal, and Trump still mentions that very regularly. He, as I think you guys would know, early on in the piece was referring to the virus as the China virus or the Wuhan virus. This really agitated a lot of people, and it led to, you know, some nasty incidents against American Asians. And I think he got the message that it wasn't a good message to be putting out there. So look, I think the reality is America will continue to do business with China, but you'll continue to hear some strong rhetoric from the president.
We've got a question from Rob McClintock here. How do you think the Main Street will respond to the stimulus package? If it's seen once again that Wall Street are getting the majority of the financial support as they did in 2008, and what's the risk of unrest?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and people are talking about that. You know, once again, the banks come, you know, with their hands out, looking to get bailed out, and you know, a lot of people are saying it seems to be every 10 years or so now the banks just lose their way and expect a handout. As I said a little bit earlier, there is a view here that you can't just blame the coronavirus on the meltdown in the US. It was not geared well to stand up to headwinds like this. And as I said, you know, one of the theories seems to be that there's just too much debt in this country. And another story we've heard, and I guess this won't surprise you guys, you know, a lot of the big money firms on Wall Street have deliberately, you know, hocked themselves to, you know, the maximum levels of debt that they can, because they wanted to make sure they had plenty in the purse to buy up distressed assets and property and whatnot over the next few months. So, yeah, look, I think you're right, Rob, that, you know, there will be public disquiet about who the money's going to. Those $4 trillion worth of loans hopefully will target small businesses. There's a lot of talk that a lot of businesses just won't come back after this. Similar to Australia, you know, restaurants and hospitality run on pretty thin margins, and the bricks and mortar rental is extremely expensive in places like New York and Sydney and Melbourne. And a lot of businesses just won't be able to come back. So they're going to need those loans to be very targeted to the right sectors. You've probably heard they've got a task force set up to try and steer the nation back, you know, back to work. And so I guess they'll be looking at the best way to get that money spent.
I just want to get back to that issue of reopening the economy too. I think, you know, that talk earlier this week took a lot of people here by surprise, as the message we got from our government, you know, coming off the Easter weekend, was that we had to hold firm on the restrictions that are in place and our current behaviours to ensure that the virus doesn't take hold again. So what's the thinking over there that's led to this talk of reopening the economy? You mentioned the pending election, that's a big one. But how do they propose to do it?
Well, up until just last week, there were still 12 states that hadn't called for a lockdown. Astounding, which again shows the complexity of politics over here. You've got 50 states, 325 million people. The states all, you know, insist on their own way of doing things and independence. It's very hard to coordinate any sort of national response here. And that's what people like Cuomo have said from the start. Look, it's no use just locking down New York City if we can't then lock down New Jersey and Connecticut and, you know, Pennsylvania. It's got to be a coordinated effort or the lockdown's not going to work. And the big fear is that, sure, we might finally get the the curve to come down and allegedly get it under control. But the head of the CDC said today that he fully expects that there will be another round of coronavirus in America, in our fall, which is later this year. We're coming into summer now. But that's been a feeling for a long time, that this virus thrives in colder weather. And hopefully the American summer will knock it down a bit. But in terms of getting back, Amy, a lot of polls over here are showing that Americans, they don't want to go back to the workplace yet. They're not willing to, well, not that they're not willing, they'll do whatever it takes to pay the rent. But they're scared. People are scared now to go back to the workplace. They listen to those medical experts saying, don't go too early, because if you do, it could be an absolute wipeout. And I think we've seen some European countries trying to reopen, and there's been a little bit of an uptick, in the infection rates straight away. So it's obviously a very ticklish issue.
Yeah, so it may well be the case that they can talk about reopening the economy, but people don't turn up for work, is it?
Yeah, well, something like 90% of people in one survey I saw said that they'd rather stay home, and I think we've all learnt that working from home now is a real option, which I guess a lot of workplaces had sort of talked about mobile and remote work for a long time, but it wasn't until we've all been forced to do it that we've actually seen it's possible. You can do it. People are running the New York Post from home. We've found that remote life is a real viable option. Not obviously for a lot of industries like hospitality and services and other industries like that, but there will be a new way of working. There's no doubt about it. And when you've got Cuomo saying that workplaces are going to have to be reconfigured to allow for 2 meters of personal distance, I mean that's amazing. And the other thing, and I'm sure in Australia they're talking about this as well, they're saying here that, say, for example, if a bar or a restaurant previously seated or was allowed to have, say, 200 people or 150, it's probably going to be 50 people now. Mm-hmm. And as you'd also know, I mean, one of the great traditions in New York is to go and sit at the bar. Can't see how that's going to happen anymore. Things are going to change.
Yeah, so I think you'd made that point to me earlier, and I guess New York, you're a little bit further down the journey with this whole thing than we are. You can probably see the implications a bit clearer, but we talk about this new normal, and new normal will be that this is not a 2-week or a 3-month or a 6-month thing, that some things will change forever and some adjustments will have to be made. Is that the way you're seeing it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what some people are worried about is, does this mean that, some people will be left behind? Because obviously the aged and certain demographic groups who have a higher rate of underlying illnesses, and they have very poor access to healthcare in the US. How are these people going to be reintegrated into the new society if COVID is now just part of life? Are those warnings for those particular groups of people going to remain in place? I suspect they might. I suspect that might be what happens for in the initial term when they're trying to get people, the first waves of people back. I would be surprised if those warnings don't stay in place for the elderly and for certain demographic groups who are vulnerable as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, just a couple of more questions that have come in. Bob Hawes is asking about the tension between Trump and the New York governor. We have a perception over here of Trump as being this sort of wacky, dangerous at times personality. What's the view over there? And do you think the governor will have the final say?
Look, it's been fascinating to watch these political relationships. Apparently, Cuomo and Trump have been speaking to each other regularly because, Trump, as you know, has fled to spend life in Florida now, but he's a New Yorker, and he knows that he can't turn his back on New York. So allegedly, he's talking to Cuomo pretty much every day. he and de Blasio, the mayor, have never got on, but apparently they're talking and they're patting each other on the back publicly. Joe Biden, who is now, as you know, the presumptive candidate for the Democrats, had a 15 or 20-minute discussion on the phone with Trump the other day, and they both came away saying warm things about each other. I mean, America is very good at putting on the right appearances. Let's face it. I mean, in the bushfires, did Australians really want politicians to be politicking? No, they wanted those damn fires out, and they wanted properties protected. It's the same here. Politicians know that the last thing that people want when their families are dying, they're losing their jobs, businesses are going under, the last thing Americans want is to see these guys, just taking pot shots at each other. Of course it happens, but to his credit, Cuomo he's emphasised day after day. He said, "I'm not getting into politics. I could make this political, but I'm not going to. It's not going to help anyone." And Trump sometimes can't help himself if he sees it, an opportunity to attack. He'll go for it. But generally, everyone's sort of trying to stay on the same song sheet.
Yeah, I've got a question from Ivanka Andrews. It's about the property market. That may not be your area of expertise, but here in Australia, we all have views on the property market. So, given the huge US debt, what's your thoughts about the future of the US property market?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. Like everything else in America, New York is the bubble. Not unlike Sydney and Melbourne, I guess, in Australia. Like it is the bubble. You travel outside of New York, and property is incredibly cheap compared to what we're used to in Australia. The numbers that we talk about in Australia, you can go and buy a very nice house if you're prepared to move away to a quieter state and a smaller city. And I'll tell you what, a lot of people are doing it because the value you get outside of New York is astonishing compared to what you get here. And it's the same in Sydney. If someone moves to Dubbo or Newcastle or somewhere like that, they get a lot of better value. It's, as I said before, word is that a lot of banks and financial companies are loading up and getting ready to go on a spending spree. Once certain assets become distressed, and there's almost no doubt that property will be one of those. New York in particular has a massive overabundance of high-end apartments that just basically sit empty, financed by Russian and Chinese interests, and basically it's a way to get money into the city, and they just sit empty. So yeah, you would think that there would be a downturn here.
Yeah, I've just got another interesting question from Kay Fraser, the Mayor of Lake Macquarie. So she's looking at it, the pandemic from an environmental perspective.
Yeah.
We've seen, a lot of reduced pollution around the world as a result of planes not flying and industrial processes not going underway. Do you think this is going to have an impact on sort of climate change policies, and that we'll ever go back to the way things were?
Wouldn't you like to think that we would learn some lessons? Like those photos above, China showing clear air for the first time in decades, and the waters of Venice are now clear, and you'd hope we could learn some lessons. I suspect that there's going to be an incredible tension between the business and investment community to not forcing, but encouraging politicians to get things back to normal as soon as possible. But then wrestling against that, you're going to have people worried about their health. So, look, I fully agree with you, Amy, and that this is an opportunity for us all to take a step back and think, oh, well, there is a different way to do things. Obviously, the downside is the destruction it does to economies and to jobs. And, as people are rightly pointing out in the States, yes, COVID-19 is wiping out a lot of lives, but health and mental health experts here are worried that massive unemployment will lead to increases in mental health and suicide and malnutrition as well. So there's not a lot of upside. It's an incredibly difficult, and it all comes back to, I think, what we've been talking about. How do we balance the reopening of our societies? What are we prepared to forsake, so that we hold on to some of these benefits that we've seen? And how do we make sure that people don't fall through the cracks as well.
Mm. Okay, look, I haven't got any more questions at this stage from the listeners, but I think just to wrap up, you obviously you have a keen interest on what's going on in Australia as well. Are there learnings from there, good or bad, you think, that we should take note of in the way we go about managing and responding to this crisis?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you guys would know much better than me, Canberra was perceived to have fumbled the ball a bit early on with the bushfires. But as I say, I really believe that you guys were on the right war footing when this broke loose. There was no way that Canberra and certain individuals there were going to allow themselves to be, painted in that sort of light again. Well, I wouldn't think so anyway. Look, I think America is always probably going to be torn apart by so many different interests that I guess for Australia to sort of see how we go about reopening and watching some of the more moderate voices and what they want to see happen. Also, what can we ask of the investment community in terms of what's the new normal for them? I mean, Wall Street has just been sending some incredibly crazy mixed up signals. So 5 million people went on the dole in 1 week, and the S&P 500 went up 6 points. And I mean, people are like, well, why is that? So there's been an interesting observation here as well, that while the president is obsessed with Wall Street is actually not the economy. The economy, is people who serve in restaurants and they serve in pubs and they drive Ubers and they work at the airports. That's the economy, and that's what we're talking about, is how we bring that back to life, and what role can the investment community play in making sure that it can support a sensible return to work and to life as we once knew it.
Yeah, and I guess the other key lesson, as you mentioned before, is that not to expect a return to full normality anytime soon. That some measure of adapting your business model will have to continue for at least the medium, maybe into the longer term.
Yeah, look, I think when you talk about it like that, there's going to be a massive role for people who design workplaces and who focus on workplace effectiveness and efficiency. I mean, in my personal situation, now that I'm working from home, it's saving me 3 hours in travel, because from door to door, it was an hour and a half each way. And so now that with that extra energy I've got, I'm happy to put in the extra time into my work and to put in a little bit of extra time at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, because suddenly I can sleep in a bit more. I can get home and spend more time with my family, although I think we're all sick to death of each other after the last few weeks. That's been a really big challenge over here, is getting obviously as to you guys too, is getting the education sector back in play. That's a really tough one.
Yeah, it might be a bit hard putting that genie back in the bottle. Now we all know how flexible it is to work from home.
Exactly.
But anyway, I think that probably just about wraps us up. Bob, is there anything else that you wanted to say at this stage? Oh, we can't hear you, Bob. Bob, we can't hear you. While we're waiting for Bob,
I'm just looking at that. Testing is being identified as absolutely the number one thing that has to be done before the economy's reopened. And America has an incredibly low rate of tests. It's only done about 3 million tests, and the health experts want 750,000 to 1 million tests being done every day in America before the economy is reopened. So, yeah, there's a long way to go on that.
So Nathan's just answering a question there from Hudson Borden about whether testing for the virus is one of the keys to help opening the economy. Yeah, I think certainly here we've seen a little bit more move towards encouragement from the authorities for people to get tested. They were, I think previously they were not encouraging people unless they were sort of showing certain signs. And I think that was to do with the limitations on the number of testing kits and the capacity to do that. They seem to be amping that up a little bit more now. Is that what's happening over there as well?
Yeah, gradually. There was a bit of a downturn over the Easter long weekend, I guess not surprisingly. But yeah, certainly there's a recognition that there has to be mass testing across the country.
And this, I just saw that question from Bob Hawes that had come in prior to that too. The National Guard and US Defence have been mentioned in assisting with the efforts to work through the virus. Is that sort of happening to any degree yet? What are they doing? What do you think the likely response is to that, to having soldiers on the street?
Well, the National Guard was called in the first cluster in America, really, the first major cluster happened in a town 5 miles down the road from us called New Rochelle. And it was an unfortunate fellow who went to his local synagogue and unwittingly infected 100 people or so in his community. And then he worked down in Manhattan as well. So he infected a whole bunch of people there. And it was seen as one of the first clusters to really take off. So they sent the I'm glad you reminded me about this. They sent the National Guard in to enforce a lockdown in New Rochelle. Well, my train down to the city, down to Grand Central Terminal, went through New Rochelle Station every morning. And I can tell you that train stopped during lockdown. People got on, they sat down beside me, they sat down beside everyone else. And yeah, look, it's sort of typical of the way things have been done here. Send in the National Guard, but what are they going to do? Apparently they were taking groceries to people's homes and things like that, but not enforcing a lockdown. There hasn't been that sort of action over here. I see that in Australia, the police have been quite aggressive in fining people. It hasn't really been like that here. I'm not quite sure why, but
yeah. Okay, well, look, looks like we've got Bob on the phone ringing in now. So I just want to say thanks, Nathan, for taking the time to talk to us today. I mean, there's no silver bullet for surviving this pandemic economically or otherwise, or coming out of it in a good way. But it's really interesting to get the perspective of someone from another place where perhaps there's been more repercussions than we've seen here, and be able to learn from those experiences. So thank you again. I'll just switch over to Bob.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Good to see you.
Good.
Yeah, can you hear me this time?
Yeah, mate.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know if you can see me. Technology.
No, I can see it.
Yeah, look, thanks very much for that, Nathan. It was very informative. It's very interesting to hear a view from the other side of the world, particularly when we're going through our own issues here, and it's so easy to get very focused and worried about just your own backyard. And there is a lot of, dare I say it, selfishness that's involved in this whole discussion. But at the end of the day, they keep telling us communication and trying to get through this together is the way to go. So yeah, I do appreciate your time this morning, or this evening for you.
No, well, I really appreciate the opportunity. I'd love to have a chat again sometime. So thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, if it goes on for too much longer, we might do a round the world thing. And anyway, so thanks very much. Thanks to Amy too for posing those questions and running the session for us. I'm sorry about some of the clunkiness at the start because of the way I mucked up being host, but we'll get used to that Zooming as we go on. And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks for taking time out. And if you've got any comments or feedback on the session, other topics you'd like us to cover, please get in touch with Amy or I or Jalinda or anybody else in the HBC team. But other than that, thanks very much. Have a good weekend coming up, and thanks again for your time today.
See you guys.
Bye. Good luck.